Mysteries await just a page away. Ready to dive in? Welcome to The Book Reader, where stories unfold one enchanting page at a time. Subscribe now and unlock the magic.
Richard Branson. Losing My Virginity, the Autobiography. Chapter 1. 17. I was almost certainly going to die. 1987, 1988. Per and I took sleeping pills the evening before the launch. When we were woken up at 2 a.m. it was pitch dark, but as we were driven to the launch site, we saw the vast balloon lit up by floodlights and towering over the trees. It looked astonishing. The sides were silver and the dome was black. It was monumental. The balloon was fully inflated and straining at the anchors. We were worried that a wind might strike up and tip it over, so we climbed into the capsule, and the ground crew set about the final checks. Inside the capsule, we were unaware of the accident which actually catapulted us upward. A cable became caught round two of the propane tanks, and as the balloon strained up and down it pulled them off. Without their weight, the balloon shot up, still trailing a couple of cables carrying sandbags. As we gained height and headed over the main forest towards the sea, Per climbed out of the capsule and cut the last two cables. We made rapid progress towards the glowing dawn, soaring along in the jet stream at 85 knots, just under 100 miles an hour. After 10 hours we had flown over 900 miles, and had easily broken the long-distance record for a hot air balloon. Over the radio Bob Rice told us to keep at 27,000 feet, whatever happened, since that was where the fast winds were. That first night we hit a storm and came down to calmer weather, but it was snowing, and we immediately lost the speed of the jet stream. "We need to get back up there," Per said. He fired the burners, and we rose again to meet the bad weather. The balloon was buffeted hard by the storm, and the capsule was tossed to and fro. But just when we wondered whether we should head back down, we shot out into clear weather and reached a speed of 140 knots, over 160 miles an hour. The next morning the Virgin 747, maiden Voyager, arrived and flew in a figure of 8 round us. My mother's voice came crackling over the radio. "Faster, Richard, faster. We'll race you." "I'm doing my best, Mum. Please thank the crew and passengers for going out of their way to greet us," I said. In fact, we sped along and crossed the coast of Ireland at 2.30 that afternoon, Friday, July 3rd. It was a dream crossing compared with the boat. We had been in the air for just 29 hours. The incredible speed of our flight gave us an unexpected problem. We still had 3 full tanks of fuel attached to the capsule, and they could well explode on landing. We decided to swoop down very low and drop off the fuel tanks in an empty field, and then come down a second time for a controlled landing. Per stopped burning propane and brought the balloon down low, so that we could see where we could safely jettison the extra fuel tanks. As we came down, the wind suddenly swirled around us, much harder than we expected. The ground rushed up to meet us. Traveling at a speed of almost 30 knots, 35 miles an hour, our ground speed was not so much the problem as our sudden plunge downward. We hit the ground and bounced along a field. All our fuel tanks were torn off by the impact, along with our radio aerials. Without the weight of the tanks, we hurtled back upward. I didn't see it, but we narrowly missed a house and an electricity pylon. We had hit the ground in Limavady, a tiny Irish village. With no fuel tanks, we were utterly out of control. Unless we could heat the air, once this rise topped out, we would fall rapidly, gathering speed like someone in an unopened parachute. We had one small reserve fuel tank inside the capsule with us, and Per quickly connected it to the burners. "It's tangled," Per said. The cables are tangled. The balloon was rising like a rocket. The top of the dome was forced down by the pressure, and the cable that hung down the middle of the balloon snagged on something and started spinning us round in a knot. The whole balloon was twisting itself into a corkscrew, closing the mouth so that there was no chance of heating the hot air inside. As we began to drift downward, I opened the capsule hatch and climbed out on top. I took my knife and hacked away at the twisted cable. "Quick!" Per shouted up at me. "We're falling fast." I finally managed to cut the cable, and the balloon whipped round. The dome straightened out, and the hole in the bottom of the envelope was open. "Get in!" Per yelled. As I dropped down through the hatch, he fired the burners full blast. We were within 300 feet of the ground, but the burst of heat steadied our descent, and we rose again. I tried some switches, but there was no power in the capsule. "Damn," I said. "No lights, no radio, no fuel gauge. Only the altimeter's working." "Let's try coming down on the beach," Per said. "We can't risk anywhere inland." I put on my life jacket and parachute, and attached the life raft to my belt. We saw the coastline approaching, and prevented hot air from the top of the balloon to reduce our height. But once again the ground wind was considerably stronger than we expected, and it swept us out to sea. We were heading northeast, and without the radio or electricity in the capsule, we were more than ever at the mercy of the wind. "Hold tight," Per said. He let out more air, alternating this with burning propane, to try to reduce the speed of our descent through the thick gray cloud. As we finally came out of the fog, I saw the foaming sea rising up to meet us. We'd missed the beach. We were going far too fast. I realized the truth of Tom Barrow's words. It was like trying to stop a Sherman tank without brakes. With horror, I watched the ocean rushing towards us. We hit the sea, crashing me into Per. We were tilted at a crazy angle, unable to stand upright. The balloon started to drag us across the surface of the ocean. We were being bounced from wave to wave. "The bolts!" Per shouted. He grabbed hold of the chair and hauled himself upward. I tried to help push him to his feet, but the capsule was smashing up and down, and each time I reached up I was knocked back. I watched Per's hand stretch out, grasp the red lever and pull it down. This was supposed to fire the explosive bolts, which would sever the cables connecting the capsule to the balloon. In theory, the balloon would then sail away and crumple into the sea, leaving the capsule to float on the water. But nothing happened. Per yanked the lever up and down, but the bolts did not fire. "Jesus Christ!" Per yelled. "The bolts are dead." The balloon was now bouncing us across the Irish Sea like a monstrous beach ball. I was knocked sideways again, and hit the upturned edge of the flight deck. "Get out!" Per shouted at me. "Richard, we've got to get out." Per braced himself against the hatch, wrenched down the levers, and pushed it open. The balloon slowed for a moment as the capsule dug into the water, and Per heaved himself up and climbed through the hatch. As I saw Per's backside squeeze through the hatch and disappear from view, I lunged after him and followed him up the rungs. I noticed that Per was still wearing his parachute. We clutched at the steel hawsers and tried to balance on the tilting capsule. "Where's your life jacket?" I shouted. Per didn't seem to hear me. The wind and the roar of the sea blew my words straight back into my face. The balloon was lurching at an angle, one side of it plowing through the gray sea. It showed no signs of slowing down. Behind us we left a foaming white wake. Then a gust of wind caught us, and the balloon lifted off the surface. Per threw himself off the top of the capsule into the cold black water. The drop seemed at least 100 feet. I was sure that he'd killed himself. I hesitated. Then I realized with horror that I was too late. Without Per's weight, the huge balloon soared up. I almost fell backward over the edge of the capsule, as it swung underneath the balloon like a pendulum. I ducked down, grabbed hold of the railing, and watched the gray sea fall away beneath me. I was rising rapidly, and I couldn't see Per. Now that the balloon was sailing with the wind, and no longer dragging the capsule through the water, it was much quieter. I watched with mounting dread as I soared upward into thick cloud, and lost sight of everything. I was now by myself, flying in the biggest balloon ever built, and heading towards Scotland. The wind was freezing cold, the sea below me was icy, and I was in thick fog. I had only the tiny emergency fuel tank left. I climbed back into the capsule. It was now the right way up, and I felt reassured to see the screens and controls the way they had been as we crossed the Atlantic. I ran through the options. I could parachute into the sea, where nobody would be likely to find me and I could drown. Or I could sail up into the darkening sky and try a night landing, should I be lucky enough to reach land. I picked up the microphone, but the radio was still dead. I had no contact with the outside world. The altimeter ticked down, so I instinctively fired the propane. To my delight, the flame surged up inside the balloon and steadied it. I had assumed that the seawater had killed the burners. I gave a good long blast, and the balloon started rising again. I was having difficulty breathing, so I put on an oxygen mask. I checked the altimeter, 12,000 feet. Thick white cloud pressed all around me. I had no sense of where I was. All I knew was that the gray foaming sea was waiting for me below. Before Per had ditched the balloon, he had told me that it was unlikely we had enough fuel to reach Scotland before dark. The remaining spare fuel tank gave me only about an hour's worth of flying. Sooner or later, I would have to face the Irish Sea again. I wondered about the explosive bolts. Perhaps they had cut through 1, 2, 3, or even 4 of the 5 key cables that held the capsule to the balloon. Perhaps even now that last cable was straining and fraying under the weight and might give way. If so, the capsule would plunge straight down into the sea, and I would be killed on impact. It was this fear which had prompted Per to jump. The capsule hatch was still open, and I gave the propane one good long burn, before climbing out once more onto the top of the capsule to look at the cables. It was now completely quiet. I could not see all the cables without leaning out over the capsule railings. Standing amid the swirling white cloud, I felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness. The cables looked intact, so I squeezed back inside the hatch. Whatever I did in the next 10 minutes would lead to my death or survival. I was on my own. We had broken the record, but I was almost certainly going to die. Per, with no survival suit, was either dead or trying to swim on. I had to get somebody to find him. I had to survive. I cleared my mind and concentrated on the options in front of me. I hadn't slept for over 24 hours, and my mind felt fuzzy. I decided to take the balloon up high enough so I could parachute off the capsule. I blasted the burners and then found my notebook and scrawled across the open page, "Joan, Holly, Sam, I love you." I waited until the altimeter showed 8,000 feet, and then climbed outside. I was alone in the cloud. I crouched by the railings and looked down. I was still wheeling through the possibilities. If I jumped, I would be likely to have only 2 minutes to live. If I managed to open my parachute, I would still end up in the sea, where I would probably drown. I felt for the parachute release tag, and wondered whether it was the right one. Perhaps due to my dyslexia, I have a mental block about which is right and which is left, especially with parachutes. The last time I had free fallen, I pulled the wrong release tag and jettisoned my parachute. At the time I had several skydivers around me, so they activated my reserve parachute. But now I was by myself at 8,000 feet. I slapped myself hard across the face to concentrate. There had to be a better way. Give yourself more time, I said out loud. Come on. As I crouched on top of the capsule, I looked up at the vast balloon above me. The realization dawned that I was standing beneath the world's largest parachute. If I could bring the balloon down, then perhaps I could jump off into the sea at the last moment before we crashed. I now knew I had enough fuel for another 30 minutes. It must be better to live for 30 minutes than jump off with my parachute, and perhaps live for only 2 minutes. While I'm alive, I can still do something, I said. Something must turn up. I climbed back inside and took off my parachute. I made up my mind. I would do anything for those extra minutes. I grabbed some chocolate, zipped it into my jacket pocket, and checked that my torch was still there. Peering out of the capsule into the fog below me, I tried to work out when I should stop burning, when I should open the vent, and when I should leave the controls and climb out on top of the capsule for my final jump. I knew that I had to judge the last burn exactly, so that the balloon would hit the sea as slowly as possible. Despite losing all our fuel tanks, the balloon was still carrying a weight of around 3 tons. As I came out through the bottom of the clouds, I saw the gray sea below me. I also saw an RAF helicopter. I gave a last burn on the propane to slow my descent, and then left the balloon to come down of its own accord. I grabbed a red rag and climbed out through the hatch. I squatted on the top of the capsule and waved the rag at the helicopter pilot. He waved back rather casually, seemingly oblivious to my panic. I peered over the edge and saw the sea coming up. I shuffled around the capsule trying to work out where the wind was coming from. It was difficult to be sure since it seemed to be gusting from all directions. I finally chose the upwind side and looked down. I was 50 feet away, the height of a house, and the sea was racing up to hit me. I checked my life jacket and held on to the railing. Without my weight, I hoped the balloon would rise up again, rather than crashing on top of me. I waited until I was just above the sea, before pulling my life jacket ripcord and hurling myself away from the capsule. The sea was icy. I spun deep into it and felt my scalp freeze with the water. Then the life jacket bobbed me straight back up to the surface. It was heaven. I was alive. I turned and watched the balloon. Without my weight, it quietly soared back up through the cloud like a magnificent alien spaceship, vanishing from sight. The helicopter flew over me and lowered a sling. I sat inside it like a swing, but each time it tried to lift me, it dunked me back in the water. I couldn't understand what was wrong, and I was too weak to hold on much longer. Eventually it winched me up and someone reached out and pulled me inside. "You should have put the sling under your arms," said a Scottish voice. "Where's Per?" I asked. "Have you picked up Per yet? Isn't he in the balloon?" The RAF man asked. "Haven't you got him?" "He's in the water. He's been there ever since I took off again. About 40 minutes ago." The pilot pulled a face. He spoke to someone on the radio, but it was difficult to make out what was said. The helicopter spun on its axis and headed off. "We're taking you to our boat," the pilot said. "I want to look for Per," I said. "I've fine." If he had survived the fall, Per would still be swimming, or more likely drowning, in the Irish Sea. The light was fading and from the air, only his head would be visible. It was like looking for a football, a gray football in a gray stormy sea. The pilot took no notice of my arguments. Within 2 minutes we had landed on a ship, and I was pulled on board. Without pausing for breath, the pilot took off immediately and headed back over the sea. I was marched across the deck and put into a hot bath. Then I went up to the bridge to see how the search was going. For 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, there was nothing. Then the radio crackled. "We've spotted him," the pilot said. "And he's still swimming. He's alive." Per's struggles weren't over. The winch that had pulled me up was now jammed, and so they had to attract a dinghy to rescue him. By the time the dinghy arrived, Per was almost dead. He had been in the water for 2 hours, swimming as vigorously as possible to keep his circulation going, but making no headway against the tide. He had no life vest on, and by the time of his rescue he was completely frozen and exhausted. It was extraordinary that he'd survived, and he later put it down to his experiences as a child, being forced by his father to swim every day in the icy lakes of Sweden. We met on board the ship and fell into each other's arms. Per had been stripped naked and wore a survival blanket. His face looked like white marble. He was blue with cold, and he couldn't stop his teeth chattering. For what it was worth, we were the first to cross the Atlantic in a hot air balloon. More importantly, we were alive. We could not believe that we had both survived. During the summer of 1987, British Caledonian had been struggling to stay in business. It took out a series of advertisements which showed businessmen singing, "I wish they all could be Caledonian girls," to the tune of the Beach Boys' California Girls, and they made a great play about their cabin cruise tartan. But it was no good. British Caledonian were losing money, and in August they announced that they had agreed terms for British Airways to take them over. It seemed to me that this takeover clearly breached the strictures of the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, in that it was the largest and the second largest UK carriers forming one company with a market share across the Atlantic of well over 50%. We complained to the Commission that this deal increased BA's share from around 45% to 80% on several transatlantic routes, but the deal was still given the go-ahead in September. BA and BCAL made great play that BCAL would be run independently, and the BCAL cabin crew would continue to wear their tartan uniforms and retain their independence. Without BCAL offering competition, BA could now turn its full attention to mopping up the last tiny British competitor, us, and then concentrate on dominating the Atlantic routes. As the BA-BCAL deal went ahead, we realized that, as well as the threat that a larger BA would pose to us, this takeover could contain a hidden opportunity for us. We had already used the increased value of our first jumbo, which had risen in worth by $10 million, to leverage up and lease a second plane, which we were flying to Miami. We wanted to expand further. Under the terms of the Bermuda Agreement, which governs international air traffic between America and Britain, there is provision for 2 British carriers between America and Britain. Our lawyers also discovered that the Japanese Intergovernmental Agreement contained the provision for 2 British and 2 Japanese carriers to Japan. With BCAL removed from the scene, Virgin Atlantic was now free to push itself forward and apply to fly these routes as the second carrier. Just as surely as Mike Oldfield and the Sex Pistols had been turning points for Virgin Music, BA's takeover of BCAL was a turning point for Virgin Atlantic. Prior to their merger, we flew only to Miami and Newark Airport near New York. Now, as the second British long-haul carrier, Virgin Atlantic was entitled to apply for the routes that BCAL had served and were duplicated by the BA-BCAL alliance. Top of our list was to fly to JFK, the main airport at New York, Los Angeles, and Tokyo. Further down, we listed 3 other destinations that BCAL had operated: San Francisco, Boston, and Hong Kong. In 1987, we had just 2 aircraft. In order to fly to Los Angeles and Tokyo, we would have to lease 2 more aircraft and double the number of our cabin crew. In the meantime, as well as stocking BCAL's routes, we were also continuing to stock Thorn EMI. In the last week of September, Trevor had finalized our £100 million loan with the Bank of Nova Scotia. Despite the stock market rising all summer, we felt that Thorn EMI was still undervalued. With £100 million at our disposal, we started buying on September 25, 1987. Undaunted by the size of EMI, we started putting in buying orders for 100,000 shares at a time. We decided to buy up to 5% of the company before announcing our takeover bid. Even if our bid failed, we knew that in the long run the 5% stake would increase in value. Immediately rumors started going around the market that Thorn EMI was going to be bid for. Some days we bought 250,000 shares, costing us £1.75 million. Other days we spent £5 million. Sometimes we sold shares to keep people guessing. We were stirring up the pot and ensuring that a high number of Thorn EMI shares were traded, which kept the bid rumors going. By the second week of October, our shareholdings had cost £30 million. During the night of Thursday, October 15, 1987, there was a hurricane in Britain. I remember walking from Oxford Gardens to Duende and looking across the green streets. They were carpeted with leaves. With so few people able to get to work as a result, the stock market was closed on Friday. But in America, the selling of shares which had started on Wednesday became a stampede. I watched with amazement through Friday evening as the Dow Jones fell 95 points, then its largest one-day fall. The full significance of Wall Street's crash did not really hit London and the rest of the world until Monday. The Sunday newspapers were full of optimistic noises, and even encouraged their readers to buy as many BP shares as they could. On Monday, the Australian market was the first to open and fell by a fifth. Tokyo fell 1,500 points. I thought that this was a great opportunity to buy more Thorn EMI shares, and I called up our broker and asked him to buy £5 million worth of Thorn EMI shares first thing. I wanted to get in there before anyone else, and I was worried that someone else might have seized the opportunity. In the event I needn't have bothered. I don't think that anyone could believe their luck that there was a buyer in the market. The broker filled his order within 20 seconds and asked me if I wanted to buy any more. There are tons more of it where that came from, he said. Finally sensing a crisis, I paused. Even as I thought about it, the London stock market fell by 100 points, then another 100 points, then another 50 points. A full day's fall of 250 points. That afternoon the Dow Jones crashed by another 500 points. Within a 3-day period, the world stock markets lost around a quarter of their value. Trevor and I got together. For me, the immediate damage was that the price of Virgin had nearly halved in value from 160 pence to 90 pence. Someone worked out that I had lost £41 million in value on my shares in Virgin Group plc. The actual picture was much worse than this. The share price of Thorn EMI had dropped from £7.30 to £5.80, a drop of over 20%, and the value of our shareholding had crashed to £18 million. The Bank of Nova Scotia was unamused. With the crash in share prices, they asked for an immediate cash payment of £5 million. Oddly enough, I was still rather confident about buying Thorn EMI. I felt unaffected by the slump in Virgin's own share price, since I was never going to sell my shares anyway, and I was absolutely certain that the share price was grossly undervalued. And since I was focusing more on the profits and cash flow from EMI, I began to see the stock market crash as a golden opportunity to buy the company. But Mountley were blown apart by the crash. Their share price collapsed by 60%, and they were unable to borrow any more money to buy shares in Thorn EMI, or anyone else for that matter. That week I had a furious argument with the two non-executive directors, whom we had brought in to represent the outside shareholders' interests when Virgin went public. Sir Phil Harris and Cobb Stenham were utterly opposed to continuing the siege of Thorn EMI and announcing a bid when we released our results later in October. But it's a unique buying opportunity, I said. It simply cannot be true that Thorn is now worth only 2/3 of its value on Friday. We know the cash we can earn from its back catalog, so in terms of straight cash to us it's a bargain. There could be tough times ahead, they warned me. This crash has changed the whole picture. But the people who buy records won't stop, I said. Most people don't hold any shares anyway. They'll carry on buying Beatles and Phil Collins albums. But everyone disagreed with me. They all wanted to see where the stock market went next. The Thorn EMI share price continued to fall until it reached £5.30. I was sure that if we could present a united front, then we would be able to raise the money and buy Thorn EMI at a bargain price. I argued that there was no good reason for the crash, and that share prices would recover soon. I told them that there would never again be such a wonderful opportunity. But they all disagreed, and since I could not persuade them, I had to let the matter drop. I expected the Virgin share price to jump up when we released our results. And so, when we announced that Virgin's profits for the year ended July 1987 had more than doubled from £14 million to £32 million, we made no reference to Thorn EMI. As it happened, our share price did not move upward. Anything but. It was difficult to understand how Virgin could have floated with a share price of 140 pence the previous year, and then our share price be halved on the back of doubled profits. The stock market crash was the final nail in Virgin's coffin as a public company. I knew that Don would be opposed to changing direction, but Trevor and I had a quiet chat about the logistics of going private again, and Trevor said about working out the finances that such a large buyback would entail. In July 1988, we announced that the management of Virgin would conduct a management buyout of Virgin Group plc. We could probably have got away with paying less than the original 140 pence per share, but we decided we would offer the same price we had sold the group for on the stock market, a large premium over the 70 pence at which shares were changing hands just before our announcement. This meant that nobody who had invested in Virgin when it was floated, all those people in the queue outside the bank who had wished me well, would lose money. Our reputation would stay intact. Trevor renegotiated the entire financial structure of the Virgin Group and set in place the mechanics for going private at the end of November 1988. It was a colossal task made no easier when our advisors, Samuel Montague, approached their parent bank, Midland Bank, to come and join the syndicate of lending banks, but were turned down out of hand. Trevor decided to dispense with Samuel Montague's services in all but name, rather than set up a syndicate of banks which would have had one leading bank as the point of contact and prime negotiator. He began to pull together a consortium of banks, each of whom he approached directly. This meant that he would have to do much more legwork, since he was speaking to them all individually, but it also meant that he could play each of them off against the others. In the end, he arranged lines of credit with 20 different banks, and we drew up an overdraft of £300 million. We bought in the outside shareholders' shares, refinanced the debt, which had been secured upon our Virgin Group plc shares, and similarly for Virgin Atlantic. With over £300 million of debt, we were so heavily borrowed that we knew we had to move rapidly if we were going to survive. We had to give up the idea of buying Thorny MI, so we sold our shares and concentrated on dealing with our own problems. I had always felt that the city had undervalued Virgin music, and now we would have to see what its real value was. Don Cruikshank, Sir Phil Harris and Cobb Stenham left Virgin. Don had carried out a superb job in recasting the company as one that could demonstrate clear lines of management. Trevor took his place as managing director. Trevor and I set about finding other companies who might wish to invest in any of the Virgin subsidiaries as joint ventures. We wanted to replace the shareholders in the city with one or two key partners in various Virgin subsidiaries. The structure of the Virgin Group was about to become extremely complicated.
And that marks the end of the current chapter. Thank you for listening to The Book Reader. Stay tuned for the next episode tomorrow. Please subscribe for updates.